At this time, I'd like to introduce Governor Wallace, Vice Chancellor of the University, Dr. Charles Young.
Thank you, Ken. I'm happy to participate in the Student Speaker Bureau program, as I always am, because I believe that this is one of the primary pieces in the structure of the open forum policy which we have on campus, which I have felt from the beginning is an extremely important part of any mature educational institution, a policy which makes it possible for us to have on this campus, speaking to the students and answering questions raised by the students, people who have a variety of opinions regardless of what that opinion might be. I think this is important in an educational institution, and I'm happy that so many of you are here today to hear this talk. Our speaker today is a man who has a background well known to most of you. He is the governor of one of the great states of this country. He is here to speak on the issue of civil rights, and I know his position on this issue is one with which most of you probably disagree, as I do myself. I do believe, however, that you will agree with me that it is important to be able, for all of us, to be able to express our viewpoint, and that you are going to give the governor that opportunity today. I present to you George C. Wallace, the governor of Alabama.
Well, thank you very much, Vice Chancellor Young, Ken Meyer, Phil Friedman, members of the faculty and student body here at UCLA. I'm glad to be here with you, and I appreciate you having invited me to come and talk to you on a matter that I know of your extreme interest in. But first, I want to say that I, too, am conscious of the fact that this is a great institution, one of the greatest in the United States, in the world, and I'm also conscious of the fact that you are number one in the ratings on your fine basketball team. And you've had some mighty good football teams, and you're going to have some mighty good ones in the years to come, too, I'll tell you that. So I'm glad to be here with you. Maybe I may convert some of you today. I don't know. Don't think so? And I enjoy being with young folks. I'm not so young anymore, but I enjoy even the singing. I might ask my friends over here, can they... I might ask them, do they know Home on the Range? That's a good one. And we got some good songs to sing down south, you know, like Your Cheating Heart and things of that sort. And we got one good one called Slipping Around. Y'all never heard that out here, though. Anyway, I have some remarks prepared here, and I will be glad to answer any question that you might send to me when we have concluded. I hope that by speaking here that you might have some better understanding of the attitude that we people in our part of the country have, and people not only in our part of the country, but throughout the country. Because there are many people who think as we do on this matter of forcing people to do that which they do not want to do, in the matter of centralized governmental control, and that's not confined to the people of our part of the country. And of course, when we talk with you and we understand your position better, then at least we might agree to disagree agreeably. And I think if we ever got to that point, that if we disagreed, we did so agreeably, that would be some progress. A misunderstanding and deliberate misrepresentation fostered by those who would subvert our heritage and our entire system of government has brought forth an era of American life which threatens to divide our people and destroy Western civilization's greatest dreams and achievements. For generations, the American Republic has been the embodiment of the hopes and aspirations of the English-speaking people. This was achieved by constant opposition to, and often by successive arms against, the unlimited power of despots and dictatorships. It gains its sustenance from a righteous dedication to a constitution which espoused the theory that a central government is a servant of the people, that this nation was never meant to be a unit of one, but a united of the many. In recent months, the whole propaganda apparatus of the federal government has been loosed in a barrage so potent that basic principles and precepts have been effectively shattered in the minds of vast numbers of our citizens. I say that if we are to abandon our heritage, let it be done in the open and in full knowledge of what we do. A change in our system should not march in the shadow of causes, platitudes, and emotions. There should be a full disclosure and a complete and open understanding by the people. The rights of a freedom-loving people should not be intruded upon without a reasonable application of the principles of law, reason, and justice. We in Alabama, along with ever-growing and imposing groups of other Americans, collectively and individually, have rather forcefully made it known that we are concerned at the continuing trend toward autocratic government, that we will not willingly relinquish the basic tenets of our system. We ask no more or no less than that you attempt to understand that we are conscientious and that we act, in our judgment, under the Constitution of the nation. The area of so-called civil rights is a prime example of what propaganda, misrepresentations, and misunderstanding can do to a governmental structure. More specifically, the Civil Rights Act of 1963, now pending in the Congress, can be used to illustrate the points that I hope that you will attempt to understand. Lloyd Wright, a member of a firm of Wright, Goldwater and Mack of Los Angeles, and John C. Satterfield, both former American Bar Association presidents, one who lives here in Los Angeles, said about the Civil Rights Act, in analyzing it, said this, quote, "It will in fact extend federal control over businesses, industry, and over individuals, with a corresponding destruction of state power in a degree that exceeds the total of such extensions of power by all judicial decisions and all congressional action since the Constitution of the country was adopted. It will in fact destroy the constitutional checks and balances between the federal government and the states. It will in fact destroy the constitutional checks and balances between the executive branch of the federal government and the legislative and judicial branches. The civil rights aspect of this legislation is but a cloak. Uncontrolled federal executive power is the body. It is 10% civil rights and 90% extension of federal executive power," end of quote. Dean Mannion, formerly dean of the Notre Dame Law School, said recently, quote, "My friends, the search for a wider and more charitable conception of human equality and fair treatment is commendable and understandable, but a good end can never justify a bad means. Federal absolutism will not protect the civil rights of anybody. On the contrary, it will end by destroying the natural God-given rights of everybody," end of quote. The gentlemen I have quoted are only three of the highly respected constitutional authorities in this country who feel that personal liberty and constitutional government as we know it are at stake if the bill in question becomes law. Each of these gentlemen, as I do, believe that major portions of the bill are unconstitutional on their face. It is difficult to find a single area of the bill which was sent to Congress in June last year which does not pose a tyrannical threat to our whole concept of government and society. As I've stated on other occasions, this bill constitutes a revolution of government against the people. Probably the most vicious feature is that which threatens the right of the enjoyment of private property, and that is one of the most basic issues in this legislation. The free and uncontrolled use of private property is a basic and historic concept of Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence. One of the main reasons that our forefathers came from Europe to carve this nation out of a raw and savage wilderness was for the purpose of using, controlling, and enjoying their private property, and to pursue their jobs and professions without fear of interference from kings, tyrants, and despots, without undue interference from government. It was their belief that rights of property based on individual incentive, ability, and effort should be absolute, a fundamental liberty as sacred as the system it spawns. There is virtually no aspect of business life which will not be affected by the public accommodation section of this bill. If you are engaged in any profession where you offer your personal services, you cannot refuse to serve anyone without fear of violating the Act. If an establishment offers goods and services for sale, hire, or use and is open to the public, then it is subject to federal regulation. Under the provisions of this section, the lawyer, doctor, beautician, barber, plumber, public secretary, stenographer would no longer be free to choose their clientele. This would include owners of retail shops, department stores, markets, drug stores, gasoline stations, restaurants, lunchrooms, soda fountains. There are numerous examples of hardships, of course, that this type of legislation could bring about. It even affects boarding houses. You own a boarding house. You want to take people that you'd like to take yourself, and those you didn't want to take under this act, you'd have to take anyone who came to your boarding house, which would, of course, take away the right of you to use your private property as you saw fit. Another example, of course, is the gross inequity apparent in the bill about personal services. Under this bill, a doctor, a barber, a public stenographer, a chiropodist, a beautician could be forced to offer their personal services to someone they did not want to offer their personal services to. In other words, this would put a person who offers personal services actually in a state of involuntary servitude. In fact, this bill ought to be renamed the Involuntary Servitude Act of 1963, because that's what... There's a provision of the so-called public accommodations portion of the Act which purports to exclude bona fide private clubs or other establishments not open to the public. However, if you read the bill, there is an exception clause which, in my judgment and the judgment of these men who I mentioned a moment ago, is a sleeper designed to destroy the privacy of private clubs, fraternal and social organizations, churches, religious organizations, the Masonic Lodge, the Knights of Columbus, and all other similar organizations could be subjected to federal control under this exception in the Act. There is a common belief that the public accommodation section is only applicable to interstate commerce. This is absolutely untrue. Any person, firm, or corporation who pays a business license to a state or other governmental body can be included in this regulation from Washington. This Act provides for civil actions for preventative relief, including injunction, restraining order, or other order. No one knows exactly what the phrase or other order implies. The same section of this portion of the Act provides that relief can be obtained by the person aggrieved or by the Attorney General of the United States. And it provides further that the relief may be obtained whether or not an individual has actually violated a section. Specifically, relief can be granted if there is reason to believe that an individual is about to violate the Act. This constitutes the beginning of thought control legislation. In other words, under this Act, you can be taken into court and tried for what you are thinking. You are just thinking about violating the Act. In the same section of the public accommodation sections, it also provides that if a business here challenges this Act, or challenging someone who tries to force the barber to shave him, and he goes into court, and the case goes to the Supreme Court, and the barber loses, under this law, that the attorney fees are taxed against him who lost. So if some barber or little businessman wanted to challenge this Act, he might be saddled with a reasonable attorney's fee, which is anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000 when you carry a case all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. And the purpose of this, of course, is to tell little people, don't you dare challenge it, because if you gamble and lose, you might have lost all the money in your entire business. This is something brand new in the matter of federal legislation. Now, my discussion at this point has been directed to only one portion of the Civil Rights Act. It is obvious to any individual who understands the very basis of our system that this portion of the Act destroys the most basic of rights, that of private property. It is argued that there must be absolute protection of human rights. And I would like to point out to you that in the countries where there are no property rights, there are no human rights. There are no human rights in Russia. There are no human rights in China. And anyone who thinks otherwise, you just visit and read. Therefore, in this country and other countries where we have guarded absolute the right of private property, they are the only countries in which you have any human rights. These rights included freedom from cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. That is, those that they say now must have absolute protection. Freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and expression. Freedom of movement, rest, and leisure is a right of absolute protection of private property, not a human right of equal dignity. In fact, don't you as individuals believe that your right to the opportunity to have and control private property is among the most important rights as you seek the security of a happy life? Godfrey Dietz, professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University, in his recent and timely books in defense of property stated, and I quote, "So often today we read that the West has no direction, no aim. But we cannot very well have direction and aim if the individual citizen is not encouraged to aim at something that he can be sure will be his permanently. And this cannot be realized as long as private property is not safe. As was stated, John Adams once said that, quote, the moment the idea is admitted into society that property is not as sacred as the laws of God, and that there is not a force of law and public justice to protect it, anarchy and tyranny commence," end of quote. In the Civil Rights Act of '63, there exists the threat of the tyranny and anarchy to which John Adams referred. These facts have not been explained to the American people. They have been hidden behind propaganda, emotions, and misrepresentations. And I was on a program yesterday, a day before, in Denver, Colorado, by a man who has a program, a 30-minute program in which he interrogates people. I told him that under this bill, every business in Colorado would be under the control of the federal government, and that they must, under this law, they had the authority to remove racial and religious imbalance in the employment in any business or industry, which meant that if there were too many Methodists or too many Orientals working in a place, not in accordance with the number of people in the area, that the federal inspector could come in and change this by having and saying that you must employ some more Baptists, or some more Catholic or less Orientals, and more Mexican Americans or more white, as the case might be. This would destroy the seniority rights of the unions in this country. And even union members all over the country are now being very concerned about it, because this, in effect, says who you can put as an apprentice must be based on the matter of removing, if all people happen to be white on an apprentice list, a journeyman, a seniority. You got to move people in the amount of color. If you got 10% of one people here, you're going to have this ethnic group moved up. But this will destroy the right of union seniority in this country. And that hasn't been explained. And so this man said, I'm for the bill. I don't believe it contains that. I said, read it. Have you ever read it? He said, no, I never have read it, but I'm just for it. I said, well, you are just typical of thousands of people who have been overcome by this emotional climate. In the name of civil rights, you say you are for it, but you don't even know what's in the bill. And and if you young people here want to know what is in the bill, you write your congressman or your senator, and you ask him to send you a copy of this bill, and then you read the analysis made of this bill by objective people like former presidents of the American Bar Association and others, who then... Well, you just read their analysis. I tell you what you do. You read it. Well, take my analysis for it then. Professor Dietz points out in his book that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations guarantees basic protection of certain rights, primarily of a social nature. With regard to property, he points out the following, quote, in contrast, the provisions of Article 17 concerning property, that is of the United Nations Declaration, reads, quote, everyone has the right to own property alone as well as in association with others, end of quote. Now, so far, so good. But then comes the second part of the United Nations Declaration, quote, no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his property. In other words, that's the end of quote. In other words, whereas the individual may not be deprived at all of his freedom of thought, religion, opinion, or expression, he may not arbitrarily be deprived of his property. However, he may be deprived of his property if such depriving is not an arbitrary one. Now, we know what arbitrary means. It means in most countries without the basis of a law. In a word, the lawmaker, whoever he may be in a specific country, has the right to deprive the individual of his property. This is indeed a far-reaching restriction of private property. The degrading of the right of property to second order, according to Professor Dietz, becomes even more obvious in view of the fact that social rights appear to enjoy absolute protection. End of quote. It is noted by Professor Dietz that the disregard for property in modern international law is not a subject of surprise, for that it is no longer made chiefly by nations that have regard for property rights. He refers to communist nations and other states in which the appreciation of private property is rather negligible. As a matter of fact, Aristotle, Cicero, and St. Thomas Aquinas all argued that property rights were ordained by natural law and necessary for the best interest of both the individual and society. Now, Abraham Lincoln took in all implications of our present situation when he said, quote, "Property is desirable, is a positive good in the world. Let not him who is houseless pull down the house of another, but let him work diligently and build one for himself, thus by example assuring that his own shall be safe from violence when built." It is readily apparent that the loss of respect for the right of private property will destroy the initiative and incentive of liberty and freedom-loving people. It is this damaging trend which we find shot through the Civil Rights Act of 1963. And I state, and there are those now who are advocating already, that equality is a highway paved with compensation. We must be compensated. Well, if you have to compensate people because of alleged past grievances, then the only way that you can do that is to take your property and your money from you and give it to someone else. And you think seriously on that, because that's a dangerous trend, because that is attacking the very right of you to own and keep your private property. In a word, these rights which an individual has accumulated as a result of physical and mental ability, labor and effort, are being subordinated to those which an individual possesses at birth. In a word, democratic government has changed its direction and appeared in the dress of a welfare state where government referees all rights and the individual is subject to the caprice and whim of an autocratic, all-powerful governmental structure. When I testified before the Senate Commerce Committee last year, I stated that in my judgment, the public accommodation feature of this bill was such a ridiculous piece of legislation that it probably constituted a smokescreen which is calculated to draw the attention of the people, thereby blinding them to other parts of the bill which are equally bad. Briefly, to hurry along here, this bill provides that all education in this country is put under the Commission of Education. And the Commission of Education is empowered to do anything that the President gives him the power to do. 8 times in the bill, the word racial imbalance is mentioned. All right, under this bill, a federal commissioner of education and an inspector could come to Los Angeles and say that you have here a section that is mostly Negro, and we're going to therefore transport all the way across town to a section that has Mexican Americans or Orientals, Negro people there to balance this off. Then we're going to take white from over here and carry them over here, regardless of the inconvenience to the child, to your child. And whenever you start letting the federal government come to Los Angeles and California and disrupt your entire educational system in the name of religious and racial imbalance, then you have destroyed even the right of you to send your child to a school that you want to send him to. Now, if you want to have an imbalanced program worked out, a balanced program in Los Angeles or California or Colorado, then let the local people decide that. The matter of local government. If you in Los Angeles haven't got intelligence enough to run your own school system without a bunch of inspectors coming down from Washington several thousand miles away to run it for you, then you ought not to have a school system, in my judgment. I already told you, of course, about the matter of employment, the matter of racial and religious balance and the matter of employment, and that's exactly what this bill does. And yet many people said, I didn't think it had a thing to do with the matter of employment. I just thought it was for civil rights for people. Yes, in the name of civil rights, they're going to change the whole order of government in this country. And as I said, union seniority Of course, there are some people who want this whole governmental order changed. I admit that, I'm sure. But I think the overwhelming majority of the people are satisfied with the basic form of American government that we have in this country today. I know that I am. Through the adjunct of federal financing, in fact, this takes over all voting of the states. Now, I know that you think, and you'll ask me questions about it, and I'll give you the answers in a few minutes, about the matter of voting. But why should the voting processes of California and of Colorado and every other state in the Union be taken over by people in Washington? Why can't the people of California handle their own electoral processes? If we've got to the point where the people in the states themselves cannot control that which they have historically done, then you just as well abolish the state of California and the state of Colorado. And I know you'd like to see Alabama abolished, but I thought I'd mention Honey, I just threw that in to keep us in good humor. But I'm glad you're in a good humor today. Please keep on being in a good humor till I get away. Through the adjunct of federal financing, the Civil Rights Act of '63 would extend the President's controversial executive order of November '62, which applies to 30% of the home loans now to 99% of all home building. In other words, under this bill, if you borrow money from a bank that's insured by FDIC, then when you build that house, the federal government has a right to tell you that you must hire certain peoples to build your house, and you cannot fire certain peoples who are building your house, all because you borrowed the money from an agency, from a bank that's insured by a federal agency. And then when you built your house by money borrowed from the FDIC, and if I came up to try to buy your house one day, and you said, well, I just decided I might not sell it, and then someone else comes the next day and you sell it to him, I can then go into court and say, yes, Judge, you know the reason he didn't sell it to me was because I was a Methodist, and he don't like Methodists, and therefore that's the reason. And if the judge believes me, then this federal court can order the deed set aside made the first day, the second day, and make you sell the house to the first fellow who came to you, whether you want to or not. And if you don't do it, you can be put in jail without a trial by jury until you do it. That's all in this act. Through the heavy hand of federal financing, the farmer, the realtor, the industrialist, the developer, and all other facets of the free enterprise system will be regulated to a degree that it will almost necessitate an okay from Washington before any action can be taken. This legislation, of course, in conjunction with statutes previously enacted, provides punishment for violations which may include not only fines but imprisonment of citizens and local officials without trial by jury. This is an attack on the jury system. Injunctive relief and restraining orders are provided for the enforcement of the act. And if you are a lawyer in law school, you know that the use of injunctions are for the purpose of preventing you don't have a jury trial when you have an injunction. The judge who issues you the injunction against you then calls you into court and says, you violated the order I've given you, I'll give you 5 years in a federal penitentiary and fine you $1 million without a trial by jury. That's exactly what he can do. Now this is serious for you all to think about. The most basic of civil rights in this country is a matter of trial by jury. Before any man's liberty should be taken away from him in any instance, he ought to have a jury of his peers pass on that. I'm for that, and I believe you are. But this act does away with the matter of jury trials, and then many people say, I didn't know that. Well, you read the bill, because it cannot even be refuted that that's not the case when you read it. No effort has been made to explain this legislation. It'll amend over 100 existing federal statutes and result in a national government with unbridled total power. Proponents of the legislation feel that explanation is undesirable for obvious reasons. If the American people understood, in my judgment, they would rise up and in protest and outrage unparalleled in this country's history. But what explanation can be given for the failure of a public being properly informed? Why have our people not risen to object to the possible loss of such reserved private rights as those incident to property, freedom of choice, voluntary association, and non-association? The answer is that the self-appointed social engineers, together with a vast portion of the news media of this country, and a substantial number of national and powerful politicians have obscured the simple fact that a master plan of change is being carefully wrought in our governmental and social system. Misunderstanding and deliberate misrepresentations marching hand in glove with inflammatory labels such as bigot, bias, reactionary, prejudice, irresponsible, racist, and ignorant have lulled the American people to a defensive position from which they fail to react. Accusations of immorality in the field of human rights have tranquilized many citizens as they quietly ignore their personal responsibility to register strong disapproval of policies and actions which are fundamentally wrong. Pressure groups which arrogate to themselves a right of choice of others, a human right which is the mark of the dignity of an individual, continue to have a field day as they lead us all to an ever-diminishing freedom. We witness intimidation in its rankest form. We see that the so-called sit-ins and demonstrations that have resulted, of course, in the loss of life, resulted in millions, hundreds of thousands of dollars of property damage, the injury of many people, is not doing any movement by anybody any good. Whenever you have a demonstration that results in violence, do you think that in Philadelphia, where they had to go in and get an injunction against people in the traditional Mummers Parade because people said we're going to stand on buildings and throw bricks on you, do you think that helps and brings about goodwill between anybody? Advocates of a bill such as we're talking about before the Rhode Island legislature, a great group of people went to the Rhode Island legislature and broke the General Assembly up last June 12, 1963. They played the banjo, and they wasn't from the South either. They clapped hands and shouted insulting epitaphs at state representatives. They carried placards bearing inflammatory statements. Well, of course, when the legislature could come back and meet, they voted against the bill because that type of conduct wasn't calculated to help the passage of any bill. In fact, I think maybe secretly they wanted to try to kill the bill, and so they went to this type of conduct. Now, activities such as those in Washington and Providence have occurred throughout the country. In Philadelphia and Chicago and New York City, innumerable cities of the Northeast, the ignoring of lawful process has been accompanied by riots and bloodshed. Now, I would like to tell you, of course, a race riot, which I hope we have no more race riots any place in the country. But a race riot is when Negro on one side, or Japanese on one side, and Negro on the other, or white on the other, and then they come together and have a clash. That's a race riot. Is that your definition of one? All right, we haven't, although I know you don't hate to tell you this, because you're going to be disappointed. We haven't had any race riots in Alabama. We had demonstrations by about 0.5% of the Negro people in Birmingham, but not a single incident in which white people lined up on one side and Negro people on another, and they clashed. No. Well, it didn't happen a single time in Alabama. You know where that happened? That happened in the nation's capital on Thanksgiving Day a year ago, when a race riot at the football game in D.C. Stadium with 54,000 people present resulted in the injury of 485 people, and yet it made the 50th pages of the Washington papers, and many people did not even see it. In places like California, the Saturday Evening Post even wrote an article about 3 or 4 months ago about it, in which they told all the facts because they had an investigation made, and yet in Birmingham, Alabama, in 45 days, there were only 69 people injured in 45 days of demonstrations. 22 of them were Negro, 22 Negro, and 47 police officers. I just wanted to wake y'all up over there. I knew that'd wake you up. 47 police officers. None of the Negroes were seriously injured. Some of the police officers were seriously injured. So, yet we made blazing headlines in every paper in the country. And when 45 days, only 69 people were injured. And yet, in the twinkling of an eye, in Washington, D.C., At the D.C. Stadium on Thanksgiving a year ago, 485 people were injured, and many of you don't even know about it as of this date. I tell you, that's the slanted, distorted versions of the press about things that do happen in my state and other parts of the country. Not once in the state of Alabama, well, I done told you that. A facet of this matter of the Civil Rights Act of '63, which is strangely ignored and avoided, which leads to additional misunderstanding, is the question of communist influence. Now, I want to bring me my affidavit over there. And I want to tell you that the people who organized the sit-ins and demonstrations in Birmingham, Alabama, there were 16 people who were either members of the Communist Party or belonged to organizations cited as Communist Front organizations who organized the demonstrations there. And we have their pictures, and we have the statements that they made. We have all of that in our files in the State Department of Public Safety. Even the federal district attorney in Birmingham, who's a federal man, said that the evidence that you have is shocking and alarming, but there's nothing we can do about it. The point I'm trying to make is this, is that the legitimate grievances of any people are not helped with the American people when they allow the infiltration of the communist movement to step in and try to lead and take over. And of course, that is the case. Now, I want to read you what I, Carl Prussian, a former counter spy for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, he's saying this under oath, and he said it before the committees in Washington. From 1947 to 1960, do hereby swear under oath and under penalty of perjury that from the years of 54 through 58 I attended 5 county committee meetings of the Communist Party of Santa Clara, California. A county committee meeting of the Communist Party consists of 1 delegate representing each communist cell in a county. The meetings were held during the aforementioned period in the following locations: the residence of Robert Lindsay, communist, in San Jose, 1954. The residence of Mayor Field, communist section organizer, Palo Alto, whatever you all call it, California, 1955. The residence of Isabel and Edwin Kearney, both communist, Menlo Park, California, 56. The residence of Gertrude Adler, communist, Palo Alto, California, 57. The residence of Carl Prussian, counter spy for the FBI, Los Altos, California, 58. The residence of Myra White, communist, Mountain View, California, 59. I hereby further solemnly state that each and every meeting is set forth above one Ed Beck, communist, who is present as Secretary of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People of San Mateo County, California, and a member of the Congress of Racial Equality Corps, presented the directive from the direct district office of the Communist Party in San Francisco to the effect, quote, all communists working within the framework of the NAACP are instructed to work for a change of the passive attitude of the NAACP toward a more militant, demonstrative class struggle policy to be expressed by sit-ins, demonstrations, marches, and protests for the purpose of transforming the NAACP into an organization for the achievement of communist objectives, end of quote. I further swear and attest that at each and every one of the aforementioned meetings, one Reverend Martin Luther King was always set forth as the individual to whom communists should look and rally around in the communist struggle on the many racial issues. I hereby also state that Martin Luther King has either been a member of or wittingly has accepted support from over 60 communist fronts, individuals, and our organizations which give aid to our espoused communist causes. Carl Prussian subscribed and sworn before me this 28th day of September, 63, George E. Sachs, notary public, and he's written a book in which he has challenged anyone to sue him for the statements that he has made for libel, because he said, when you do sue me, I'm going to prove it. I would like to also point out to you that the top advisor to Martin Luther King in the movement is a self-admitted communist, Jack Odell, in which even Martin Luther King admitted that he has been a communist, but he has now changed his attitude from communism to that of Christianity and morality. Now, Bayard Rustin also, who led the movement organized it on Washington, I don't know whether you know about these things. He belonged to the Young Communist League. And what I'm saying, if the Negro people have movements that they want to present to Washington or to Sacramento or to Montgomery, they should be led by they themselves who have good records and good background, because you'll have more chance to receive help in that regard. But Bayard Rustin was a member of the Young Communist League. He also attended the Communist Convention in 1957 as an observer. He also is a man who was arrested for making speeches against the war with Germany and Italy. He served the whole World War II time out, most of it, in a federal prison because he was a draft dodger. He claimed he was a conscientious objector, but the federal court said, no, you haven't proved that, you're a draft dodger. So here's a man, and of course he was convicted even on other charges here in California, you know about that. But here's a man who is leading a march on Washington to fight for people's rights, and yet he refused to fight for his country against Germany and Italy and Japan in World War II. And therefore, I don't think that's good leadership, and that's not helping any movement in the so-called civil rights matter one single solitary bit. The sit-in, and I want to read you what in 1958, January 6, J. Edgar Hoover said in testimony before the House Appropriations Committee, quote, the Negro situation is always being exploited fully and continuously by communists on a national scale. Current programs include intensified attempts to infiltrate Negro mass organizations. The party's objectives are not to aid the Negroes, but are designed to take advantage of all controversial issues on the race question so as to create unrest, dissension, and confusion in the minds of the American people. On March 3rd, he testified further, 61. The sit-in demonstrations in the South were a made-to-order issue, which the party fully exploited to further its ends, end of quote. On January 24, 62, Hoover, before the House Appropriations Committee, said, I quote, since its inception, the Communist Party USA has been alert to capitalize on every possible issue or event which could be used to exploit the American Negro in furtherance of party aims. In its effort to influence the American Negro, the party attempts to infiltrate the legitimate Negro organizations for the purpose of stirring up racial prejudices and hatreds. In this way, the party strikes a blow at our democratic form of government by attempting to influence public opinion throughout the United States, end of quote. That's the end of J. Edgar Hoover's quote. I think you may agree, as I go to conclude here, that the syndicated columnist Holmes Alexander last year said this about testimony that I gave. Last week, quote, he said, Southern Governors Barnett and Wallace flapped the red flag in words much like Hoover's, but the Barnett-Wallace testimony before the Commerce Committee's Civil Rights hearing was too self-interested to be effective. Another red object, the red herring of McCarthyism, came scurrying into the caucus room where McCarthy once performed. The subject of communist complicity soon got lost amid pious horror of smearing the Negro race and its leaders. Somebody suggested that J. Edgar Hoover be summoned as a star witness on the subject, but Chairman Magnuson was against it, end of quote. I believe that this quotation from Mr. Alexander's column best illustrates the substance. In other words, when governors like myself made the statement, of course, they wouldn't accept it, but Mr. Hoover's statements are sprinkled freely throughout all committee hearings in Washington, but they paid no attention even to that. I do not come here to tell you how to handle your local problems, but I think that we in good conscience must forcefully fight every device which reduces individual freedom. And we do not defy for defiance sake, but out of the responsibility and obligation that we feel that we have. I would say that you people here in the matter of local government can handle your own affairs better than people in Washington can handle them for you. I do not ask that you not be misled, that you forthrightly determine the truth, that you not be emotionalized into relinquishing a free, democratic, God-given system. And I might point out to you, as I conclude, that in all my public life, I have never made a single solitary remark that reflected on any man because of his color, race, creed, or national origin. I'm not a pseudo-intellectual. I'm a countryman from Alabama who believes in God. And I believe that God made us all. He made the Negro and He made the white, and He loves all of us. And any man who would despise another because of his color, race, creed, or national origin, I feel sorry for him, because life is too short to be despised in the handiwork of God. And therefore I hope that you will accept that. That is absolutely true, whether you believe it or not. My conscience is clear. Every effort that I have ever made as governor of my state and in public life has been in the interest of Negro people, because segregation serves the best interest of both groups. In Alabama, where we have large numbers of the Negro race, and all you've got to do is look at places where they've tried it, where there are large numbers, such as Washington and Philadelphia and other places in Chicago, and there's the proof for it itself. While I was in the legislature of the state, I sponsored the bill that built the largest Negro trade school in the South. I served for 2 years on the board of trustees of Tuskegee Institute, whose chairman was Basil O'Connor of New York, the law partner of Franklin Roosevelt, because of my interest in Negro education. In my present capacity as governor, we are building 8 new Negro trade schools and junior colleges in Alabama, because we feel that therein lies the solution to many problems. When we train people to take their place in this complex society, we can get them employment, and all these other matters then are subservient if you people have a job and a good standard of living. I appreciate you listening. I appreciate your courtesy, and I hope that you'll come to see me in Alabama sometime. Thank you very much.
Those of you who are going to leave for your 1 o'clock class are urged to do so quickly and quietly. In the meantime, we will begin with some questions directed to Governor Wallace. First question being, do you agree or disagree with President Johnson that the civil rights movement is now a moral issue, and why?
No, the civil rights issue, in my judgment, has never been a moral issue. It's a political issue. And if there were not large numbers of people block voting who was for this issue, you'd never hear anything about it. I don't hear them paying any attention to the Indian problem in the country, and that's people that are more mistreated than any people in this country, but you never hear anything about it because they're not organized with a large block vote. No, it's not a moral issue. It's a political issue.
Want me to read it?
Yeah, you can.
Since schools are supported by taxes paid by people of all races, why do you bar them entry if they meet academic requirements?
Of course, we do not bar people from entering colleges. We bar them sometimes from entering certain colleges, but not... In fact, we have fine schools for both races in our state, and my children cannot go to the Negro school in my little town, nor the Negro to the white school. They both have good schools. I don't see where there's any discrimination. However, if the Supreme Court, and you believe as the Supreme Court says, that one group of people cannot get a good education unless they mix with another group, it seems to me that they're trying to brand somebody as inferior. If I were a Negro, I would resent any opinion of a court that said that I couldn't get a good education unless I mix with a group of other people, because I feel that a Negro can get a good education by mixing with people of his own group. If I were a Negro, I'd resent that.
You're concerned for the right of property being valid in opposing civil rights bill. How do you reconcile the inability of your state to protect these rights of your own citizens? Are you using a double standard, protecting your rights and failing to protect the same rights of others?
Well, of course, in my judgment, we are protecting the rights of all the citizens of our state. And I think that's an answer to that question. No, we don't use a double standard at all. And actually, I feel that anybody, regardless of their color, creed, race, or national origin, are entitled to the same rights that I have. And I think that every citizen of this country, whether he be white or black, is entitled to equal treatment of the law. Now, I would like to point out something that you don't read about. You know, we talk about, of course, Abraham Lincoln was a great president. But Abraham Lincoln made some statements that if he were living today, I want you all to hunt up the debates that he made with Stephen Douglas. If Abraham Lincoln were living today and said the things that he said in the days that he was president in public life, he would be being picketed by you people here, because Abraham Lincoln said, oh, wait a minute now, he said this, and you check, you got libraries here, you can check. He said, I reckon, I know you have a good library here, you got everything good at UCLA. Abraham Lincoln said that he didn't think that he thought that we couldn't exist part free and part slave, and I agree. But he also said that he didn't believe that Negro should be allowed to vote, sit on juries, or hold public office. Now, that's a statement of Abraham Lincoln. You check your libraries and check his debates with Stephen Douglas. I don't know what that had to do with this question, but in other words, I'm trying to say I disagree with Mr. Lincoln. That's what I want to say. I disagree with him. On that particular score, I think Negroes are entitled to vote, hold office, and serve on juries. And they have served on juries where I've been a judge, too.
You stated that a good end never justifies bad means. If you consider the Civil Rights Bill of 1963 as bad means to the good end of equal rights, what do you consider as good means?
I consider good means of putting of an emphasis upon a massive good educational program and to try to keep people in the respective states from dropping out of school. Whenever you can't keep people in a school system, they drop out by the hundreds. Then 10 or 15 years, when they hunt a job, they can't find one because they're not qualified. And when they drop out of school in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, and you can't even keep them there, and we have that terrible problem in Alabama, then when they come up to try to register to vote, they can't even read and write. I think that the way that we can get good means is a matter of inducing more industry to come to my state so people can get jobs. $338 million worth of new industry came to Alabama last year, more than any amount that ever came in any one year. Every one of these new industries are going to employ Negro people, and I travel all over this country talking with industries and help bring a lot of them there. Yet, if Martin Luther King were to spend his time and his group sitting down in New York and California saying, why don't you bring a branch plant to Alabama or to Mississippi or to Louisiana or Florida so we can employ people of my race in that state, then he would be doing some real good things for his people to enhance their standard of living. And when that is enhanced, then of course other things come in the way. But he spends all of his time trying to create a climate that's not inducive to industrial development, so the very people we're trying to help cannot get jobs. I say the way that is to build trade schools, encourage education, and equip people to go out in this life. Marching in the street and throwing bricks and injuring people has never helped any cause, in my judgment, in modern days.
Governor, you have painted a dismal picture of the Civil Rights Bill. Quote, the public will be irreparably injured, unquote. Who does that leave to benefit from it?
No one's going to benefit from it. If this bill passes as now proposed, there's one or two things going to happen in this country. You're going to have a police state to enforce it, a federal policeman in every beauty parlor, or it's going to be like the 18th Amendment, unenforceable, and then it's going to be turned back to the states eventually by some sanity on the American governmental scene.
Governor, aren't your so-called Jim Crow laws of your state more oppressive to Negroes who do not want to be segregated, who do want to vote, than the, quote, Involuntary Servitude Act of 1963?
Well, of course, you know, the Jim Crow laws, of course, as you talk about, is separated seating in buses and so forth, and that doesn't happen in Alabama anymore. We don't have segregated seating in the buses in Alabama anymore. We have over 100,000 people voluntarily segregate themselves, as they do a lot of places, even in California, you know. In fact, I've been reading in the papers about things out in California. Everything's not so peaceful and good out here. If this great state here, who's so liberal-minded and wants to do all these things and have been doing them all these years, why are they having the pickets and sit-ins and demonstrations in California? I thought y'all were already up to snuff on all this business out here. And I'd like to also point out to you people in California, and this is a great state, and I'm not reflecting on it at all because it's one of the greatest. But you know, there's a lot of big talking about liberalism, like in Berkeley, you know, where a great liberal town of Berkeley. And yet when they went to vote on this anti-discrimination housing ordinance, when the folks got the hood around them and they got in the ballot box, they voted just like folks from Alabama vote. They voted and so in 1948, which is not too long ago, They submitted an FEPC to the voters of California. It was defeated by over 1 million votes, 600 and some odd thousand to 1,600,000 and some odd thousand against it. You check your California history. You folks vote like Alabamians and Mississippians when you have a chance to vote on it. Some people do a lot of talking about things, but when they think it's going to affect them in some direct manner, then they go the other way. It's just like in Boston the other day. The woman who led the ticket for the Board of Education was charged by the NAACP as being a segregationist. A segregationist. They came out against her. I was in Boston, and they even said over the radio and television, she thinks like Governor Wallace does of Alabama. She said, I will not move children from this section of Boston to the other section and vice versa. Lo and behold, this woman who thinks like Governor Wallace received 127,000 votes, and the nearest NAACP candidate was 56,000 votes, and even one Boston paper the next day said evidently the people of Boston do think like Governor Wallace of Alabama. So when they had it brought to the lick log of transporting their children from one section and integrating as they try to do us in Alabama, they voted no, 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 no.
Have Negro citizens of Alabama been consulted on how they feel about segregation in their state?
Well, of course, when you talk about the leaders like King and them, of course, we know how they feel without having to consult them. But I'll say that I have had many Negro people in Alabama, whom I list many as my friends, whether you believe that or not. Many as my friends who are not concerned with anything but the fact that this agitation is not in their interest and they don't like it. And I believe there are many Negroes in Alabama who are dissatisfied with some of the agitation. I have discussions with Negroes many times. In fact, we have Negro college presidents in Alabama. Do you have it in California? Do you? You don't have any Negro. I don't know of a Negro college president in California. But we have about 15 in Alabama, so you can aspire to be a Negro president of a college in Alabama. And I have to discuss with them, and we have trade school directors who are Negro. I consult with them many times about the amount of new courses and the amount of building trade schools. Yes, I have a lot of contact with Negro people.
Mr. Wallace, do you feel the, quote, local government in such states as Mississippi and Alabama will ever provide the equal rights or merely voting rights to its minority citizens without federal intervention? If so, when and how?
Of course, I can't speak for other states, but I can say insofar as Alabama is concerned, that any Negro who can qualify under state law is allowed to qualify. Now, in Alabama, we have over 100,000 Negroes that vote as of this moment. We had about 85,000 a year or so ago, and now we have over 100,000. And I think that's the other day, the federal court forced the admission of 2,000 Negroes who had been refused over a period of several years because they answered, and this is typical, on a simple literacy test, do you belong to an organization that advocates the overthrow of the government by force of violence? They said yes. Would you bear arms in defense of your country? They said no. They didn't mean yes or no. They didn't belong to subversive organizations at all. They just didn't understand the question. They would decline registration. Those who cannot read and write because they dropped out of school, they cannot register in Alabama. That's the same in New York State. You can't vote there if you can't read and write the English language, so we don't have any different from New York. So the federal court comes along and orders the registration of these 2,000. 1,100 whites were turned down for the same cause, and they are still unregistered voters because the federal court does not come in and order the registration of whites, but it does order the registration of Negroes turned down for the same reason as the whites. I believe in anybody having the right to vote who qualifies under the laws of the state of California, any other state. I do not believe in keeping people from voting who are qualified to vote. I never have. Now, Negroes in Alabama have a funny way of voting. They vote in a block, 100%, 1958, in an all-Negro ward in Mobile, Alabama. I received over 1,700 votes, and my opponent received 4. 4 years later, in the same ward, my opponent received over 1,700 votes, and I received 3. And in Birmingham, in a mayor's race, in one all-Negro ward, one man received 3,600 votes, the other man received 4. In a sheriff's race in a county with 5 people running all saying the same thing, one man gets all the votes. This is not inducive to good government. And a person who fights for the right to vote ought to exercise that right as an individual. He ought to exercise it as an individual. When he exercises it in a block, then he's doing something that's not inducive to the democratic Republican form of government in which we live. But I'm for people voting regardless of race, color, creed, or national origin.
Governor Wallace, are you still a candidate for the President of the U.S.?
Well, you know, I'm a Southerner, and there's a lot of prejudice and bigotry and bias against us, you know. And I do hope someday that all of us working together can remove the prejudice and bias and bigotry that you give on a man just because he lives across a certain geographical line. I think that'll be a good civil rights movement for you people to not be prejudiced against people because of where they live. I may run in some of the preferential primaries, and I have no illusions about the chances of a man from our part of the country, but might run in some of the primaries like Ohio, Indiana, and Maryland for the purpose of informing the people about the Civil Rights Act, which they have not been informed about and what it will do. And I feel that from the amount of mail that I have received from those parts of the state, we're going to get quite a few votes if we do run in some of the primaries. But, of course, I have no illusions about my being president, unless some of y'all want to support me out here. We'll go ahead another.
We're out of time. This will be the last question.
Two more.
Which would you say was more important to the majority of Southerners? Are they more concerned with the economic and political aspects of civil rights, or are they more concerned with preserving the status quo attitude toward the Negro?
Well, of course, status quo, there's no such thing as that. We're moving along all the time. But I do think on the matter of social and educational segregation, most Southerners want the status quo. But for good things in the economic, jobs and better standard of living and better housing, we are all for wanting Negroes to have that as well as white people. I want to thank you for your kindness and courtesy, and I hope that God blesses all the people of this country and we solve all these problems. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Associated Students, I'd like to thank Governor Wallace.